Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Bird. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Traceable, and here to talk a little bit today about changes that are under consideration for the OWASP API Security Top 10. And it's getting a revision since its last publishing in 2019. And I want to give you access to other resources as well. My conversation is definitely going to be at the IT executive level in terms of what you need to be thinking about relative to these changes, what it means and its implications for API security, as well as the evolution of the API threat. And my colleague and friend, Inan Shketi, who is our Director of Security Research here at Traceable, just recently did a webinar. I'm sure that will provide a reference point for you in the materials here. Did a technical deep dive around these changes within the OWASP API Security Top 10. So if that is more inclined to your interests, definitely suggest you take a peek at that webinar. I thought it was exceptional. Inan always does amazing work for the company and for the community. With that being said, we'll go ahead and get right into the presentation. And I think first I want to set the table, right? What are we talking about as it relates to API security? And what I find really fascinating with the pending changes or the changes under consideration for the OWASP API Security Top 10 is a recognition that API security is evolving and maturing into a much broader attack surface, evolving and maturing to a much broader array of risks and threats than just application security. Not to discount the importance of API security as it relates to application security, but I think it's incredibly important to point out that if we look at the news of the last 12 months, what has become very, very clear is that bad actors are leveraging APIs to conduct attacks that go well beyond application security. In fact, a pretty decent and reasoned argument can be made that in that 12-month period of headline news for API attacks, not one of those have been a application vulnerability. In fact, they've been things that look more like fraudulent account takeover, token forgery, fraudulent account creation, attacker in the middle attacks, all of these types of attacks that are really more representative of operational security and risk, versus, say, pure application security. So when we think about that in the context of OWASP Top 10, what we can clearly start to understand is that API security is beginning what probably was an inevitable natural progression into full, layer 7 security or application layer security at the transactional level. And when I mean transactional, I mean some of the things that you see here, which is APIs are being created to access and unlock massive amounts of business value between application systems and processes, but it also is creating opportunities for the bad actors to leverage all of the attacks that were previously available in the old layer model of security, where you used to have to pinpoint your attack type into each one of these specific areas. And if I wanted to leverage, an attack vector to go after, say, web applications, I would, have to be really, really, conversant, really understand how to bypass, get around, or obfuscate my intentions as it related to a web application firewall. Same with endpoint security. Whether it be configuration attack or going, from endpoint security to data loss prevention technologies into data exfiltration and data leakage. I had to come at it from multiple different sets of technology. But when we think about this evolution, when we think about this change of APIs and how they're being capitalized on to unleash this massive amount of business value, we cannot deny the fact that we have created a universal attack vector. And that universal attack vector is allowing bad actors to just simply go around, ignore, or operate as if many types of security technologies that we have previously depended upon in the past are no longer there. The example that I like to use frequently in this is the old DDoS attack on firewall network perimeter in data centers. Right. I was a CISO and a CIO in my prior working past, and it used to take the bad actors a lot of effort to accumulate massive amounts of email clients to be able to use those email addresses and domains to launch an attack, a flood attack, if you will, against those perimeter defenses. I don't need to do any of that today, right? I just need an API, possibly, generate a massive amount of volume of bots, but I don't need to go anywhere else to get the tools necessary to do an application level DDoS, right? I can now attack your application with substantially less effort than it used to take to attack your network and your firewalls and your perimeter, and have the same net effect, right? If I bring your business applications down and you are a predominantly digitally driven organization, company interacting with your customer base, I basically have taken you out of business. Same as it was 15 years ago with taking your firewall down, or DDoSing you, rather. So, think about this idea that APIs have evolved and matured into this universal attack vector, allowing every possible attack type, not just application vulnerabilities, but all of these other capabilities that bad actors have used. And now think of that in relationship to the OWASP API Security Top 10. So, I think it's, really important for us to take a pause for a second. And before I dive a little bit deeper into the OWASP API Security Top 10's changes that are really being driven by this evolutionary pattern that we're seeing, I think it's really, really important to come back to a truth that simply gets lost in today's massive amounts of security solution technologies and processes and huge organizations and budgets that have been stood up for security. The bad actors really only care about one thing in the sense of corporate attacks, and that's the data, and it's always been the data. And it's not the applications. No bad actor is out there going, hey, I've got the application, and I can control all of its features, functionalities, and capabilities, right? And even when a bad actor steals source code, they're doing so that they can find a better pathway or an easier pathway for them to get to what? The data. So when we think about this capacity for APIs, which are very much an integration of the application layer and the data that is fueling these applications, we can see why the bad actors are so interested in this space, because it's a faster path, and it is and unfortunately at the moment, a much less burdened with friction path from a security and a breach and exploit standpoint than they've had in the entire history of the evolution of security. So data is the key, and the access to that data is what drives bad actors and their behaviors. And now we come to the reality of API security. Now, the reason I dove into that point about data as opposed to, say, application vulnerabilities is because I knew that my first example was going to be the accidental exposure of sensitive data. And this is a really interesting flow, because this is exactly how one of the most publicized breaches of already this year in 2023, how the hack and the breach actually happened, right? Accidentally on the developer side, after doing work on an API call, the encryption requirement for that particular call was removed. Placed into production, bad bots were scanning, looking for insecure APIs in production. Boom, it finds one. The bad bot accesses that PII data, and then all of a sudden, tens of millions of accounts, customer accounts, are exfiltrated from the system, right? That's not an application vulnerability, All right, just to emphasize the points that I'm making here about why it's so absolutely necessary for OWASP Top 10 for API security to grow with the knowledge and information that we're gaining, the data, the real-world attacks, the real-world consequences. It's really, really critical for us to be addressing that in something like the OWASP Top 10 for API security. Stolen identities. I mentioned, the capability to be all of these different types of attacks. Well, credential stuffing is definitely, proven to be an extremely lucrative space in the API security problem or equation for the bad actors. Again, why? Because they can use APIs to generate massive amounts of volume that were, used to be reserved for a number of other types of hacking techniques. But in this case, they're taking information that has been stolen from multiple personal information breaches that have happened over the last several years. And then they're just simply taking those identities and jamming them into, forgotten password reset flows. And in many cases, those particular flows are not API rate limited, right? And then they continue to cycle through with this, API enabled form of credential stuffing, and then once they get access, they're no longer, detected by the WAF, right? So, it looks like the kind of transaction somebody should be doing as it relates to gaining access to an account, except it's a fraudulent account takeover. It's being done in massive volumes. APIs aren't being rate limited in these circumstances. The possibility that you might see it because of a curiosity about an increase in volume simply won't save you from the way that these attacks are being executed using today's technology. You really have to get to the API security level of inspection and understanding what an API is doing in order to be able to stop this kind of action. So, those are a couple of real-world examples of where I'm saying, look, the world of APIs from an attack capability standpoint probably isn't growing as much as it's maturing. It probably has always been this broad and always been this deep. But we're starting to see the manifestation of real-world outcomes and consequences. So it's that additive data that is informing OWASP and the team that is building API Security Top 10 to make the necessary changes that a lot of people in the industry are strongly in support for. So let's talk a minute about OWASP API Security Top 10. It is a list that defines the top 10 threats for API security. It's similar to other top 10 lists that have been developed from OWASP over the years with multiple different working committees. And I just want to take a pause and just say thank you to all of the people that put their work and energy and effort into these types of efforts and activities, because it's extremely important to the security practitioner. Should be extremely important to all of us relative to implementing programs that are focusing on the right risks and the right threats. But it does help us understand the top API security issues today. And it's obviously recognized not just by API security vendors and the press and analysts, but our customers as well, collectively. So we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and it's the reason that I started in API security after a long career focusing specifically in the cybersecurity space on identity. And it has to do with authorization. One of the challenges that we see today is that there is a tremendous amount of power, kind of going back to the massive business value unleashed by APIs. There's a tremendous amount of power in what has historically been an extremely poorly managed security frontier, which is the authorization layer. And APIs really depend upon the authorization layer for the access to discrete elements of data and information from inside systems, processes, databases, all that good stuff, right? So I think it's really interesting that when we see authorization for the risk that it really is, we see that OWASP is putting more focus on the reality of the power of authorization. So what they've done is they've melded two previous OWASP top 10 items: excessive data exposure to mass assignment. All right, and they have transformed this particular top 10 security issue into broken object property level authorization. So it really is combining, again, a data-driven exercise, combining the understanding experiences over the last several years as it relates to security outcomes and saying, okay, these two particular items that we'd listed previously are definitely part and parcel of the same larger macro issue, right? The object, being at the top line, the property being the next tier down relative to understanding of what a API is supposed to be doing. But this recognition of the incredible importance and power of authorization as it relates to API security, for me, is very encouraging, because we have to get better, not just at API security, but we have to get better at the granularity of controls in the application layer to ensure that we're only authorizing the least amount of information necessary to complete that particular transaction, right? So it is, to me, authorization is a next tier conversation around extending least privileged into the authorization layer. But I'm really, really happy to see this particular change. Now, when we think about the authorization challenge, look, it's incredibly important to differentiate between a guest and a host, and then a host, that is operating under certain kinds of restrictions, say by an organization like Airbnb or VRBO, or you kind of name the persona type or the company type, right? When we look at this, it's very, very clear that from an API endpoint standpoint, a rental guest should not be able to access the same types of information that a rental host should be able to access. So when we look at these particular pieces, it is in this level of granularity at the authorization layer that we begin to see the ability to do bad things, right, as a bad actor. So I think that if we look at the reality that OWASP API Security Top 10 is forcing us to be more specific, more pointed in our observations about what resources and assets each of these types of personas can get to in the course of a transaction, you can start to see why A, this particular authorization change is important, and B, why, if you're paying attention to it, it can yield net positive effects to the reduction in risk in your organization. So let's talk a little bit about API bots. This speaks directly to a focus on a lack of automated threat protection. Bots as a business model are becoming extremely profitable for bad actors, and let's be really cautious here. And let's just say people who are playing by the spirit of the rules, but breaking the rules nonetheless. Think about things like scalping or amassing large amounts of new release materials, whether they be shoes or cars or NFTs, or there's just so many different variations of kind of these discrete offerings that have limited times or have VIP exclusionary rights, or are leveraging things like pre-sale customer codes, which I use all the time because I'm a huge music fan. These bots are rapidly becoming a huge economic gain to bad actors, as well as people that are, like I said, playing by the published rules, but the outcomes that they create are patently unfair for consumers and citizens. There's also a lot of AI ML type of in-feeds going into bots that is providing them with more information to be more successful in the campaigns that they're exercised for. And the reality is that these bots are able to bypass a lot of security controls because they look like they're somebody or a thing that should be interacting with you or with other companies. And detection of these requires looking at all the requests in the context of the application's business logic, right? Does it make sense? The pre-sales ticket example. Does it make sense when, say, a radio show's subscriber base or listener base is maybe, let's call it million people, right? Large metro market. And yet the pre-sales code associated with the email distribution that goes out to their entire listener base has generated 2 million requests for tickets, right? That is, a patent violation of the business logic associated with the transaction. But if you don't understand the elements of the context that I just walked through, your security solution is never going to catch that particular attempt by bad actors to corner the market on early sale tickets so they can go back out and scalp them later, right? And I know I've mentioned a couple of these before, but look, the gears should start spinning in your head as a CISO, as an IT executive, about how these API exploits are used to capitalize on these early stage pre-sales item purchases, big sporting events, all these different variations. We don't really talk a lot about this as being a cybercrime, right? And the reality is it is. It's because it is creating fewer resources for the intended audience or the intended purchaser, but also creating additive economic gain for the bad actors in this space who do massive, massive markups. I know this because there's a concert coming up. Many of you know I live in Denver. There's a concert coming up in Red Rocks that I would love to see, Duran Duran. And all the pre-sales codes that I had were gone instantaneously, minutes after the release. And I can't go see Duran Duran because those tickets are somewhere in the neighborhood now on the secondary market of $1,500 to $2,000 a seat, and when they were $80, right? And so, do I feel put out? Am I a victim? Maybe not. But do I feel put out about the inability for me to go see Duran Duran at Red Rocks? Absolutely, exceptionally so, since it was bots that really kind of took my seat. So let's talk a bit as well about server-side request forgery and APIs. Another change within the OWASP API Security Top 10, and I think this is incredibly important. I am so happy to see this happening because this emphasizes the point that I'm making about the evolution of API usage and exploit, as well as the evolution of API security. The need for us to focus our attention on the encrypted credentials and the credentials that are facilitating access to critical resources is, I don't know that I can overstate it. The problem with server-side forgery, or the problem with any form of credential or encryption forgeries, certificates, tokens, is that we operate in a world, unfortunately, where security frameworks have really not matured well beyond the authentication stage. Not to go down a rabbit hole of a different set of topics, but as it relates to zero trust, this is one of the fundamental foundational weaknesses in almost everybody's security program, is we authenticate once and we allow many, right? And I love an old mentor of mine, a founder of one of the most successful identity companies in the world, and he said to me, Richard, if you authenticate the wrong person, you still have a bad day. And this is very much true in the case of APIs, because in many cases, we're using APIs to automate access on behalf of human beings or customers or entities, whatever the case might be. And once server-side forgery has been successful, then we are seeing a world where authenticate once, even with forged credentials, and then access many. So I think that it's extremely important for OWASP to focus its attention in this space. And obviously, it comes with a recognition or acknowledgement that, again, this is not pure application security. All right, this is very much transactional, API transactional-driven security. So unrestricted resource consumption. It also called out as a brand new item in the OWASP Top 10. This has been interesting to watch now as a security practitioner in the API security space. APIs enable a huge uptick in capability as it relates to enumeration and brute force attacks, as well as application DDoS attacks, right? The ability to create or generate massive amounts of volume without having to have massive amounts of owned kit, if you will, is something that we've seen developing over the course of the last couple of years in API security, and now something that is manifesting itself as a huge, huge problem. And so we're seeing a lot of focus and attention on things like rate limiting and the ability to detect say flood attacks from specific geos or specific IPs or whatever the case might be. But the reality is that it was absolutely necessary for OWASP to take a look at the behaviors of APIs and recognize that APIs are the network, APIs are the system, APIs are the presentation layer, APIs are the APIs are actually everything everywhere all at once, to steal a title of a recently successful movie. And because of this, I think it is also encouraging to see OWASP taking a step that recognizes that the traffic-like capabilities of API are leverageable by bad actors to do bad things. So unrestricted resource consumption is a change that you want to pay attention to. And the unsafe consumption of APIs. This one is really a big problem. And I always kind of like tip a hat to my friends in open source security because it is part and parcel of the same type of problem, which is from a DevOps standpoint, we are inclined to trust APIs that are supposedly made available to us by well-known companies or well-known organizations. And unfortunately, it is becoming very clear that APIs are being introduced into these ecosystems by bad actors in a very effective way that allows them to embed bad things into consistent or continuous transactional channels, right? Literally the worst of all possible scenarios. The use of a third-party API that's supposed to be vetted and validated from a partner, a solution provider. You kind of name the entity, and yet it actually came from a bad actor, and now it's embedded into the genetic code of your business application or your business process. So the unsafe consumption of APIs, as an OWASP Security Top 10, again introduced recently for consideration, is absolutely critical. If you are in a space where you're feeling pressures from SBOM, or you're feeling pressure from demands for understanding of risk associated with supply chain attacks and threat, if you're zero trust focused, if you're defense in depth focused, literally every variation that you can think of begs for an attention to be paid at APIs that are coming from someplace else either whether they are accessing you or whether they're being consumed and used, it's absolutely critical for us to focus our attention and our understanding on whether or not they are truly represented as what they say they are, what they're supposed to do, where they're supposed to be sending data, who they're supposed to be connecting with. You can see why this particular change, was inevitable, right? Because as more APIs are being developed, more and more companies are offering APIs as the pathway for access to their own systems and processes. But you can also see why, the use of this particular capability by bad actors has driven the community to orient its thinking as it relates to one of the OWASP top 10 security, or top 10 for API security, towards the unsafe consumption of APIs. So, with that, I think we're getting a little bit closer to the end of my presentation than we were at the beginning. So API security, I want to talk for just a second about context. So I mentioned, contextual awareness in the ticket scalping example for my sadly missed Duran tickets, right? And I think that, one of the things that commonly comes up when I'm having customer conversations or when I'm at a conference, as I currently am, talking to a number of folks, is that there's a lot of talk about contextual security. What rarely happens is a definition of what contextual security means, because there is no universally agreed to definition of contextual security. And at Traceable, we take a very specific stance on this. We believe that contextual security is the information that enriches an API beyond understanding what it's designed to do. And the enrichment of that API is based on a very old structure. And I love that my friend and colleague, John Kindervag, recently announced as an advisory board member for Traceable. I love that, as my mentor, he shared with me this idea of contextual security being bound in what's called the Kipling method. And the Kipling method is a very old construct that was put together by Rudyard Kipling. It was a writer of much acclaim, and his position was, to understand context, you need to know the who, what, where, when, and why. And all of that information ultimately leads us to understand the how, right? And only when we understand who, what, when, where, and why as it's associated to a thing do we have a fighting chance of knowing whether it's doing what it's supposed to be doing or not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So in this particular case, we're seeing an acknowledgement within the OWASP API security top 10. We're seeing an acknowledgement of many of these elements of context, and it really is the basis of our product orientation at Traceable, which is, when we look at API activity for an API, and we look at it for all APIs, but when we look at it for just, say, an API for abstraction purposes, what API calls are being made at the edge, what API calls are being made internally, what are the sequence of those calls, and data flow, where is it going to, what is it accessing, activity history. Has this particular API only been used for X frequency, but now all of a sudden we're seeing a 5X increase, right? Because we know the what, or the when rather, of that particular API from an activity standpoint, when it is typically used. When it's being used at a much higher frequency, now we have a delta. We clearly understand that there's something going on, right? This is context, right? It isn't knowing a thing. It's knowing as much about that thing as you can possibly know within the construct of your systems and your processes. So it's absolutely critical to have that full context, and that full context for us nets to this ability to add all of that information in an API data lake. Our API cataloging capability is the 360 API context. That is all the information that has been enriched and added to the API design, and then all of the components of ownership, risk, change, dependency, attributes, integrity. And then being able to obviously deploy that across a multiple number of deployment methods, internal, external, hosted third party, mirror, edge, in-app, serverless, and then, as I mentioned, inclusive of everyone that you're exposed to from a supply chain or risk standpoint, and take all of that information about those APIs and put it in a place that, we can successfully run threat intelligence against. And I say successfully run threat intelligence because I'm going to be very, very blunt here. If you don't know what normal looks like, you can't possibly know what abnormal looks like. Doesn't mean that you can't get lucky. And it doesn't mean that you can't be opportunistic and maybe find an eye within an eye within an eye of a needle, using, something without a normative baseline. But it is an extremely suboptimized way to use threat analytics to be successful in enabling the ability to see all of these different types of attacks and more, right? Unless you know normative behavior, which in Traceable's case, we uniquely provide the ability to see all this context associated with that API. You do not have a fighting chance to find and pinpoint these types of threats and attacks. Like I said, you might get lucky, or you might find that you can cover, the most minimal layer of these attack types, but you cannot really protect your organization with this without this type of context. Comprehensive API security platform, our security posture management really is that all things about the API and the threat protection is associated with how do we leverage the all things about that API to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Threat management, the threat analytics engine, combination of threat protection, threat management allows us to be really precise on what bad things are happening, be able to put those in risk prioritized focus for you, so that you can take the action necessary or use orchestration automation to execute the type of protection actions that you want. And finally, secure SDLC. You can imagine with this much information about APIs that the ability for us to have a tremendous base of knowledge as it relates to secure SDLC or API testing is greatly augmented by all of the information that we have about a company's APIs, how they behave, what they're doing, and so we provide those capabilities and that visibility into our testing suite as well. So with that being said, I know there are a couple of other examples to share with you. The accidental exposure of sensitive data is interesting because all too often companies don't find out about the accidental exposure of sensitive data until well after the fact. But leveraging capabilities as it relates to API security, we know that an identified attack that has been sussed out, if you will, in the combination of our threat engine and our data lake, allows you to actively fix that data leak instead of having to deal with loss after you've discovered it. This ability to stop an attack in line based upon these risk factors and risk indicators that are sorted through the threat engine is unique, again, to Traceable, and it has a tremendous amount of value because it saves you from having to do the forensics report for the breach and the loss of that data that you didn't know about until well after the event had happened. Stolen IDs, again, same, kind of dynamic when we talk about the use of our proprietary data lake. We're able to sort out the number of unusual requests that may be coming in, say from a get user API, and then we're able to triangulate these attack vectors or attack indicators and get a clear understanding of whether or not IP rate limit rules should be enacted, right? So, call volumes are not the only indicator of an attack, and sometimes they're a bogus indicator of an attack. Think seasonality, right? But where's that attack coming from? And I don't know if I have it in the presentation, But the most recent interesting example I've seen of this in real time, actually reported on it in one of our webinars, myself and Arpit Patel, one of our amazing folks here at Traceable. We saw a situation where a bad actor was basically leasing IP space here in the United States to several sanctioned nations. There were actors in those sanctioned nations that were launching, very similar to this, launching huge volumes of new account creation calls. And it looked like it was coming from a location where good traffic would be expected from. It was only when you evaluated the actual underlying API information, got deep into the DNA of that API, did you understand that it was actually being sourced from companies that our nation has declared as enemies. And in our case, then it allows us to triangulate that information across the who, what, where, when, why, and invoke the IP rate limit rules and be able to shut that traffic down, very simply. So with that, that's the last example that I'm going to give. If there's a, too long didn't read takeaway from today's conversation for the CISO community, it is, number one, the API threat and attack surface is huge. It is massive. It is deep. It is broad. The API threat and attack surface allows attackers to attack assets and processes and systems that used to require at least a certain amount of domain knowledge and expertise at other layers of the security stack. And now, unfortunately, it is, to hopefully not use an inappropriate term for this, APIs have democratized the attack surface for bad actors, creating, third point, the universal attack vector mentioned earlier in the presentation. So I would say, when we think about API security, those are the three key takeaways. When we think about the changes in OWASP API Security Top 10, they are orienting towards the reality of what I just said, which is the attack vectors are much more diversified than just application security. Authorization really is the layer of access that is keys to the kingdom, if you will, and that the attack capabilities really require us to evaluate what to include in this most recent wave of OWASP API security threats. So with that being said, I'm always available as a resource for you, and just always enjoy the time to share a bit of information about what's going on with an API security and cybersecurity writ large. As always, thanks so much for listening. I'm sure I've probably got another half dozen webinars coming up from any number of channels soon. So hopefully you'll be able to stop by for the next one. And thanks again.